let's begin. Looks like we've got a great turnout. Thank you all for joining us for one of our regular workshops at the Center for Cultural Affairs here at IU. We are really happy to see all the smiling faces and everyone taking some of their lunchtime or whatever time it happens to be where you are to join this great talk, where we're going to have Stephen Hadley speaking, but Alan Brown is going to actually take over as Master of Ceremonies. So I'm going to hand the mic over to them and let them take it away.
Thanks, Doug, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alan Brown and coming to you from the Motor City of Detroit, Michigan. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm kind of blown away by the names in the squares here. There are numerous gods and goddesses and demigods and demigoddesses, so I've just gotten very anxious, but no. Stephen, I have the easy pleasure of introducing Stephen Hadley. Stephen has a long list of wonderful, distinguished credentials. He's a researcher working at University of Ireland, Galway, and University of Leeds. I know Stephen from intersecting with him at conferences and reading his work, and I really think Stephen's book has certainly rocked my world and is a really major contribution to our field. So I'll just say, Stephen, I would add to your titles that of troublemaker. I think you're the most dangerous kind of academic, which is you started as an arts marketer. So you actually understand the implications of your research on practice, which I think is amazing and wonderful and something to celebrate. So Stephen, go ahead and make us some trouble, and we'll be loaded with lots of questions. And I just encourage everyone to add your questions to the chat feature as we go.
Thank you, Alan. And thanks everybody for inviting me to give a talk. We're a very esteemed company in this talk series. I'm very grateful to be invited. On a personal note, I have to say it's actually really great for me to be sharing this virtual stage with Alan. Many years ago, when I was a much younger man and not a particularly good arts marketer, I had the great privilege of introducing Alan when he gave a keynote at a conference. And I distinctly remember being sat on the stage in that conference hall thinking, this is it, I've peaked. Like, I've introduced Alan Brown for a keynote. It's all downhill from here. What the hell am I going to do? So it's quite a delightful, purely personal perspective to actually be doing this event with Alan. So thank you, Alan. And I also just very quickly want to thank Ellie Belfiore and Ben Walmsley and Michael Rushton, who at various key points in this long process over many years have encouraged me to continue and get me to this point, so thank you. I would also thank all of the people who gave their time very generously for the book, but as they were anonymous, I can't thank them, but they know who they are and they have my love. That's very much appreciated. So let me start share my screen. So, hello, that's me. I was going to say I put a photograph of myself on my opening slide, not out of vanity, but just in case anybody arrived slightly late and looked at me and thought they'd wandered into the wrong seminar, just to confirm that that is me. And if there are any potential future employers in the audience, pre-COVID, Stephen is available at very short notice, should he be required. So I'm going to talk about the book. I've been wrestling with this for the past few days to try and get the book into a series of PowerPoint slides, and I found it difficult. So it's going to be really interesting for me because I know some people are here who've read the book to see whether they think I've actually managed to actually capture what they thought was important in it. And the book has quite a kind of complex interlocking framework of arguments and ideas, which I found quite difficult to try and get into a kind of linear PowerPoint kind of format. So we'll see how we go. I'm going to focus more on the structure of the book than the content. And in honor of the location of our host today, I'm starting and finishing with quotes from American academic Kevin Mulcahy. So this was kind of my jumping off point for all of this work, which is a democratic state cannot be seen as simply indulging the aesthetic preferences of a few, however enlightened. Consequently, a democratic cultural policy must articulate its purposes in ways that demonstrate how the public interest is being served. There's an awful lot going on in these two lines, and there's an awful lot of implication about what may or may not be happening, or maybe being seen to be happening, or maybe being done in order to facilitate things being seen to be happening. But it was an interesting jumping off point for me to think about the role that audience development played in this process. What is audience development? This is the quote, one among very, very many. I think there's about 20 in the book from my dear friends at the Audience Agency. I'm not going to read this out. There are lots of definitions of audience development. There's a whole section of the book which discusses quite why there are so many definitions of audience development and how they came to be. This definition I like. It's interesting to map the progression from that kind of third sector triple bottom line, which always used to appear, I think, in Keith Diggle's initial 1976, 1978 definition of arts marketing. Those core elements were there that we still see in this definition today. The way I approached audience development in the book is about this aspiration of cultural policy to change people's cultural consumption. The need not only, I guess, to be seen to be changing cultural consumption, but of course to change it, to make it more democratic. And the frame of the work is obviously around the publicly funded arts, predominantly in the UK, in terms of the context, but where I can and where it made sense in the book, I used US examples, and specifically in Europe around the kind of the northern Scandinavian social democratic countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, particularly. Because both in those countries and in the UK, because we have this Keynesian post-Second World War model of public subsidy based on taxation, it's obviously absolutely imperative that within models of taxation, which are universal across the population, we have this moral imperative and ethical imperative to ensure that people are fully engaged in that process. And we see the outplaying of that universally in very similar ways. We see it in touring models, we see it in the building of arts centres, we've seen it in the building of civic venues in towns outside cities, we've seen it in agendas on rural arts, and we also see it in an organizational context with certain organizational functions around education and outreach and audience engagement and so on. So the way that this moral imperative within policy manifests itself is how I started to see audience development as I kind of entered into the research. What became really interesting to me was how what I could call democracy as a discourse, if you like, legitimates that subsidy and legitimates the models that we have, because we talk an awful lot, both as practitioners in the cultural sector and academics, about this thing called the status quo. Whether we're trying to disrupt the status quo, whether we're trying to challenge the status quo, whether we're trying to shift the status quo, whether we're trying to change the status quo because of social justice issues or racial issues or class issues. And all of those things for me sit within this kind of discourse of democracy. How does this idea of democracy as a principle of public subsidy start playing out? And what, more importantly, is stopping those manifestations of democracy from having more effect? What is the vested interest at play that kind of perpetuates these systems? You could call it hegemony, you can call it status quo, you can call it a kind of institutionalized power, however you wish to see that. And I'm not going to talk about it in particular detail now, but one of the really interesting threads that runs through the book is how all of these definitions of audience development I referred to, and really the really inherent ambiguity that is there in it as a term, somehow enabled it to become this normative practice in the cultural sector. And I'm not going to talk about that now, but maybe pick that up in the Q&A. One of the really interesting things for me, and I probably identify this more in the American tradition than in the UK one, was if you only did desk research looking at audience development, you would see it as what I describe here, a process-oriented technical function of marketing management. And it's remarkable how practices such as audience development are seen as kind of philosophically and ideologically innocent modes of management, as if they do not exist in a policy arena, but simply exist as things to be put into textbooks with flow charts. And for me, it was a really fascinating kind of outworking of how our arts management as a field, when people go into arts management, I think they either focus on the arts or they focus on the management. And there's a really clear division in the field of the people who are definitely just about the management, but it happens to be in the arts, and people who are all about the arts, but it happens to be talking about management. And for me, audience development was never about a process, it was about a practice, and it was never about management functions. And when I started to do the interviews and talk to people, it was about beliefs, it was about philosophies, and it was about ideologies. The crunch for all of this in the UK context is when these objectives to democratise culture begin to appear to have failed. And I've put two examples here. One is the Warwick Commission on the future of cultural value. The other is the DCMS's Taking Part data. I think we're at a really important stage in terms of comparative cultural policy, where at a national level, different countries have now got quite radically different forms of access to empirical data sets about audiences. And what's happened in the UK over the past 10 to 12 years is that the existence of these data sets, both at a national level within the government department, but also within the kind of audience finder system that the audience agency has, and at an organisational level in box offices, the ongoing ability to have longitudinal rigorous data sets has caused us to question how and if this process of democratization is working. How much longer can we carry on with it? What needs to change? And I would say we're also at the point where the new public management desire for audit and accountability and the huge drive in the cultural sector to capture and gather and analyze data was ostensibly around this idea of evidence-based policy making. But of course, we're at the point now where we have sufficient evidence for evidence-based policy making, but we're not seeing the changes in the policy on the basis of the evidence. And I do think what we've had from the Second World War on, particularly in Western Europe, is we've had this very similar model, but now we're getting these really small but really important divergences, dependent on whether this national policy conversation is informed by data or not. Just very briefly in terms of methodology, I did 30 in-depth semi-structured qualitative interviews. The shortest was about 2 hours, the longest was 14 hours, not in one go, I should add. And I guess if I was summing up the book in one sentence, which I've done here, it's to seek to reclaim audience development for cultural policy. So I said I'm going to talk about the structure of the book, which I'm going to do now. I'm going to finish just with one little bit of content from it, but I thought if I didn't do the structure of the book, then a lot of the conversations we have in this session wouldn't make sense. So the structure of the book is conceptual framework, dilemmas, and traditions. And I'll just explain that as I kind of go through these slides now. So the conceptual framework at the most macro level is what I've started referring to as the epistemic universes of the democratization of culture and cultural democracy. There's a whole section in the book about this. I've put the verses in inverted commas there. There's obviously quite divergent opinion on whether these modes of thinking or philosophies are in opposition or binary or in tension or can operate within the same arena. And a very conscious cultural democracy in the US has a slightly different meaning and discourse around it than it does in the UK. But this is the policy schizophrenia in which everything else sits. And we recognise in the UK context, democratisation of culture, more than anything else, I think, from this phrase, great art and culture for everyone, which was the Arts Council's strategy. But of course, the intellectual history of these ideas and the intellectual history of the democratization of culture significantly predates the Arts Council. It obviously runs back through many centuries. And of course, cuts right across the great European tradition. This is a photograph I took when I was teaching in Germany a couple of years ago for Untitled, which is exactly the same kind of concept. The book employs concepts of tradition and dilemma. These I took predominantly from the work of Bever and Rhodes, the political science model, to really use this model, this conceptual framework, to understand the beliefs, the meanings, the way that the people I interviewed, who essentially kind of, I would say, created this idea of arts marketing and audience development, certainly in the UK field, how they narrated their own practice, how they understood what they were doing in a policy context, how they understood what they were doing in terms of their own personal belief systems. And I think what's really fascinating is it's impossible, there is no textbook or academic work on arts marketing or audience development that moves underneath that kind of desk research process of saying, well, what did these people at this time think they were doing? How did they understand? How did they articulate to themselves? And this model of traditions and dilemmas was extremely useful in terms of unpacking that. The three dilemmas that are identified in the book, and this is where I really feel I'm not doing justice to the book, because there's kind of a chapter on each of these bullet points, but they are in chronological order: marketization, social inclusion, and failure. And they roughly sit in the 80s, the 90s, and kind of post-turn of the millennium from the 2010s to now. Dilemma of marketization sits in that Thatcherite Reagan era, when for the first time the subsidized cultural sector was forced to confront this kind of neoliberalism, I guess, where suddenly there's all this talk around philanthropy and fundraising and being more corporate and being more businesslike, and the beginning of that process of articulating the value of culture within econometric frameworks. And that really was a great dilemma for the cultural sector in terms of how to engage with that, how institutionally for the Arts Council and its very kind of gentlemanly ethos, it could begin to engage with these ideas of marketing, which, as many of the interviewees say in the book, was considered a kind of very dirty and toxic term by the Arts Council. As we progress into the 90s in the UK context, when we briefly get a Labour government and humanity appears on the political stage briefly in the UK again, after many years of Tory rule, we start to engage in this process of social inclusion. And I think this is where the book articulates this shift from arts marketing to audience development as this wider social remit begins to be engaged. I'm not going to talk about the linguistic complexity of all of these phases, though I do talk about it a lot in the book, about how marketing and arts marketing and audience development were received at a kind of at the level of language as much as the level of ideology. But there is a lot of hinterland and discussion in the book for anybody who's interested in that. And the third dilemma of failure, which should probably have a question mark against it if I'm fair, is really around a lot of the discourse that we've had in the UK. I mean, an immediate example would be John Holden's work about the crisis of legitimacy of the arts. Equally, I remember a talk that Ben Cameron did in the States when he was at the Doris Duke Foundation about the need for the arts sector to be relevant to communities and so on. And it's a really obvious point to make, but I will make it anyway, which is that if something needs to be democratized, it's not democratic, okay? If something needs to be made relevant, it's irrelevant, okay? So it's odd how we engage with these terms, but we don't kind of necessarily articulate the corollary of it to ourselves in terms of what we're actually saying. And the traditions of audience development, there's two really distinct different ways that people narrated their own beliefs about what it was they were doing. Now, I should say, when I went into this process, I had quite a simple kind of way of thinking about what this research was going to be, because it seemed to me that what I was going to find was that audience development was a management tool for the democratization of culture. And that's what people believe, and that's what they thought, and that's what they were going to tell me back. And then I was going to go away and write this up, and away I go. And it was really surprising to me to discover, as I did the interviews, that not only did some of the people I interviewed know what cultural democracy was, and were quite familiar with some of the writings, which to most cultural policy academics are quite obscure pieces of work. But as I began to unpack this process, more and more people were saying to me, no, I didn't believe in the democratization of culture. That was never what I was doing with audience development. It simply was not my belief system. What I was doing was cultural democracy. And that forced me to really identify these two different articulations, these two traditions, which I came to call the arts lover tradition and the social justice tradition. The arts lover tradition, actually, what I'll do is, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this particularly well, but this is a table that I put together to try and gather all of these ideas. I've annotated it quite a lot from what it used to look like, so I can get it on one page of the book, which was an interesting process in itself. But what you'll see at the top in the orange, there's the democratization of culture and cultural democracy, and each of these two columns goes down at the bottom to the arts lover tradition and the social justice tradition. And I've tried to articulate the different philosophical, ideological, and to some extent practical differences that came out here. And this is obviously also based on a lot of the academic literature going back, as you can see here, Benjamin and Nietzsche. But there were certain obvious things here. In terms of democratization of culture, key to that obviously is a belief in this kind of universal or objective value, as opposed to the contingent, subjective or relative value in cultural democracy. For democratization of culture, art is always art with a capital A. Under cultural democracy, it may or may not be art. Duchamp's urinal being an obvious example there. And there are key things around whether the focus is the work of art or the focus is the process of creation. And we can see here how different ideas of cultural value can be mapped on to these different outplayings and different outworkings. And also at the bottom, there's a kind of sense of progression, if you like, if you can have progression between two columns from modernity to post-modernity as well. Audience is passive, audience is active, silent and contemplative reception, which is kind of your Kantian position, as against may involve participation and co-creation. So there's everything from Kant to Bourdieu in here. There's this idea of community art, participation, etc. I should probably, even though it's in the book, think of it as a work in progress, because I'm sure once people engage with this, I'll start thinking about it more. But that was kind of an attempt to get these two traditions down on paper. And all of the interviewees were in one tradition or another, in terms of why they had done this thing called audience development, what it meant to them, and how it continued on. And what was interesting was as well, talking to policymakers and investigating how this discourse worked, that the two traditions had quite fundamental ideas about this, about actual democratization. Because what's interesting politically is, if you take something that's undemocratic, but are nonetheless able to say, no, it's fine. I know it's undemocratic, but we're democratizing it. Look, here, look at our wonderful works. We are democratizing this. That can be accepted as, okay, fine, you're democratizing it. Now, when we put that simple structure in terms of, okay, the Black Lives Matter moment, that process is starting to be rejected now, because people have started to say, no, your statement on Black Lives Matter is just performative. It's just a way of signaling that you think you should be seen to be doing something, but you're not actually going to change. And so whilst people in the arts lover tradition would say, no, we just need to continue with this process of democratization. We need to continue this work, ostensibly for another 70 or 100 years, who knows. Whereas the people in the cultural democracy and the social justice tradition would say, well, when is time up? When have you had enough time to do this? And we have to say, stop, you're not doing that anymore, you've failed. We need to really radically think about restructuring now, because all that you seem to be doing is telling us from endless reports for decades that, oh no, we understand there's a problem and we're addressing it. But then nothing changes, you know. I'm old enough now to be able to see the next generation and the generation after that coming through discovering the same problems that we faced, thinking that they're new problems, but nothing changed. Anyway, that's another talk. And I think the other interesting and salient thing to say is that, again, obviously, I guess, in some ways, is that it was the arts sector that needed audience development and not the audience. Audience development functions more for the benefit of an undemocratic or undemocratized cultural sector than it does for the audience. As within this quote, I don't think there are huge swathes of the population saying, give me more access to arts and culture. Particularly in the social justice tradition, there was a much more ready agreement, but I think actually across both. The ideas that we talk about now around everyday creativity and different forms of kind of ordinary culture were perfectly fine. And these kind of old, what were seemingly becoming patrician ideas of engaging people in high culture just were no longer kind of acceptable. So I want to close just by bringing a lot of this up to date in the English context. So this is Arts Council England's 10-year strategy called Let's Create, which came out just pre-COVID in January 2022. And was foreshadowed by an awful lot of talk from both the chair, chief executive of the Arts Council, about a shift towards what was ostensibly, in all but name, cultural democracy. And there is a line in this report that says, we do not believe that certain types or scales of creative activity are inherently better or of greater value than others. That, to me, I can hear John Maynard Keynes spinning in his grave, along with every former chair of Arts Council Great Britain and Arts Council England at that statement, because whilst at this point it remains rhetorical, because the strategy it's not an action plan, it's a framework, it signals a really fundamental shift. And the first 3-year delivery plan for Let's Create is due later this month. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether this rhetoric around cultural democracy is actually made manifest in any meaningful way. And I do think it would be interesting to see whether the Arts Council is moving essentially from the left of this table to the right in terms of that, because the implications potentially for its client portfolio and how it exists as an institution after nearly 8 decades are really potentially quite radical. So I'm just going to close with this sentiment and one example. The sentiment being that whatever the global, national or local context, relationship with audiences are always deeply ideological and never merely a function of management processes. And if I get people to believe or think any one thing after having read the book, that would ideally be it. So I'm going to close just with one bit of transcript, which still really resonates with me. This is a picture of Crescents in Hume, which is not far from where I grew up in Manchester in northwest England. When the Crescents were built in 1972, it was the largest public housing development in Europe, with 13,000 people brought in to live in the Crescents. It was a huge disaster of social engineering, lasted just over 20 years before it was demolished, and was just deeply problematic in many ways. And I have this picture on my wall, which you can't see now. It appeals to me in my kind of socialist radical Manchester upbringing. And I fully recommend to you the British Culture Archive, which is where I bought it from, if you're ever in the mood for some kind of presence with swearing and anti-police sentiments in them. You know where to go. The reason I'm showing you this is because I had a really interesting conversation in one of my interviews. We were talking about an audience development project that ran in Hume, where the Crescents are, which was to try and get young Black children involved in ballet. And it was really, I think it was what's described as the peak of kind of absurd audience development initiatives in the 1990s, when there was vast amounts of money swirling around and people were really trying to get, as one of the interviews said, dragging in people kicking and screaming to things that they had no interest in seeing. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of transcript and then I will close. So this, I'd also actually, so I should say, I had just written as Alan would probably like, a slightly provocative piece in the Stage newspaper, asking why does the Arts Council fund ballet and not hip hop? So this was very much on my mind at the time that we had this conversation. So it opens with the interviewee, and he's saying, what sort of outcome do we want from this project to getting these black kids involved in ballet? You know, the outcome we want at the end is that it enriches their lives, gives them a new perspective, gives them opportunities, gives them an outlet to express themselves, have their say. And I said, well, by that definition, do we need more Kendrick Lamar and less ballet? To which they said, well, ballet would have to prove it can do it. And they said, but it hasn't, has it? So that, sorry, I was going to say, that felt to me a moment at which these tensions of these ideas of democratization, these ideas of practice, and everything else were brought into sharp relief. So I am just going to close, as I promised, with a quote from Kevin Mulcahy again. While culture may speak to everyone, not everyone chooses to listen. I would kind of say, well, we could adapt this now, can't we? Because we now, or do we? Maybe it'd be interesting to find out. Accept that actually these hierarchies of culture are possibly doing more harm than good. And we might say actually that, you know, maybe people can listen to any culture they like, and maybe that's good enough. Maybe Kendrick Lamar is more important than any ballet dancer that's ever lived. Discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yay. Thank you for rocking our world, Stephen, and congratulations on your really incredible analysis. So I want to leave plenty of time for all of your or any of your questions. I have a long list of them myself, and I just want to say start by saying how enthusiastic I am, Stephen, that you've surfaced this analysis, because it, you know, at least in the US, it addresses a set of issues that are burning right now, and maybe, just maybe offers a ray of light for what change might look like. And that's, you know, in cultural, you know, in raising cultural democracy as a sort of complement or schizophrenic partner to democratization of culture. I mean, we might be able to live with schizophrenia. That would be progress. So, you know, I have questions about cultural democracy as a concept, as a movement. It's not new, but it really hasn't been in our lexicon so much. And you know, as a consultant, I've come to understand that introducing vocabulary, you know, can move the field if people kind of grab a hold of something important that they can understand in a new way. So, but back to democratization of culture, you know, reading your book, which for me was like traumatic because I had to read every sentence 2 or 3 times just to understand what you mean. You know, it was really above my pay grade, but you know, richly rewarding. And as I got through it, I kind of had this sinking feeling like, oh my God, the work we've been doing around audiences for the last 20 years is, you know, we've been thinking we're doing the work of the Lord, and we've actually been doing the, you know, making a deal with the devil. So I think when people read this, there will be, you know, strong reactions one way or another. And a lot of people will feel like a lot of their work has been invalidated. And that the social inclusion, which comes from a beautiful place in the heart, is actually been in error. So what would you say to people who have that reaction?
Actually, dealing with that right now, because I just, one of the next steps for me, having finished the book, is a chapter that I'm just finishing writing for an edited collection that Ben Walmsley and some colleagues are producing, because it's where I kind of started using this term epistemic universes, because what's really interesting for me is exactly that point. If you have gone into the cultural sector with a great passion, and there's a growing body of evidence now that shows, of course, that the requirements of social mobility and cultural capital and so on to get a foothold in the cultural sector are such that it generally is people with certain modes of upbringing from certain families and certain kind of life experiences and so on. What would you do in that context if, for example, as we're seeing in England now, the Arts Council suddenly pivots from democratization of culture to cultural democracy and goes, actually, kids, we've changed the rules of the game now, and those things you were doing before don't necessarily resonate so much. It's called Are We the Baddies? And it's based on a sketch, a UK comedy sketch where there's two Nazi soldiers in the Second World War start discussing their uniforms, and they're like, have you seen our caps? They've got skulls on. Are we the baddies? And it's kind of playing with that idea. So I've used this term ideological precarity because we talk a lot about the kind of financial and economic precarity that people in the cultural sector are subjected to at the moment. But I would argue, certainly in the English context, and I say there's a big but here, because we don't know in this kind of post-COVID scenario where the Arts Council are going to go with this. But there is an ideological precarity there. Because, as you say, some people go, well, actually, this belief system that you have passionately been, working towards is wrong. Now, of course, that two things. One is when you say the work of the Lord, because there's a lot in the book about the semi or pseudo religious nature of a lot of this. A lot of the language around audience development, and I see it now as well, particularly in the US. I have a real anathema. I come out in a rash when I hear people talking about serving and this mission, because I know organizational mission just, to me, sounds like missionaries with Bibles going out to the jungle. And there's this the whole kind of cacophony of language now that we've got ourselves into in the cultural sector, with this kind of pseudo-religious talk about the transformative potential of culture as if it were a new religion after the death of God. But yes, it's a concern. I don't know if I have an answer to that, other than to say what I suspect will happen is that both of those traditions, as they have done within audience development for many years, both of those positions will continue to exist in the cultural sector for quite some time, because they exist there now. I mean, this is the interesting thing with, the democratization of culture and cultural democracy is a binary, or, a polarity, or as I said, a schizophrenia is. If you really rigorously interrogate it, and I kind of often say this, it's like when you can't believe in multiculturalism and apartheid at the same time, right? But you can have a society that has both multiculturalism and apartheid, because these two philosophically opposing ideas can coexist in practical terms. So we're dealing, and this is where arts management and cultural policy has to navigate between the real and the conceptual and the theoretical. In that we can write a dry academic book about you can't have these things. These are fundamentally opposed. What would Kant say about cultural democracy? But on the ground, it's messy. So I'm not sure I've answered that question, but that's my ramble.
No, thank you. I think a lot of people have gotten very comfortable with that schizophrenia, and maybe you're making them uncomfortable all over again. Which would be a good thing. So
what was that thing? What is it? God, I'm going to show myself up now by possibly getting this wrong. But what was it that Francis Bacon said? Art should comfort the. I can't remember. Somebody will know this about comforting the troubled and troubling the comfortable, or something like that. It was a great. Anyway, somebody Google that and jump in and tell us what it was.
So, Stephen, we don't have a lot of cultural policy here in the U.S. At least you have an arts council in England that purports to have policy. In the US, so much of our policy is tacit, it's implicit in, particularly in the philanthropic sector, tends to be a driver of policy in our sector, which has very much led us into audience development and diversification of the audience and social inclusion. And plus, I think a lot of people just believe it's the right thing to do. So it's kind of, there's a moral imperative in the field. And I think what's so challenging is we're saying actually that's still problematic in so many ways. But I want to go to cultural democracy because we have, cultural democracy is not new. It's been around for decades. Yet it's not really part of the discourse, or at least it doesn't have a lot of legitimacy for a variety. I'm thinking of the wonderful writing of Arlene Goldbard. What's so hard about cultural democracy? Like, why don't we have structures of cultural production devoted to cultural democracy? Why isn't it a bigger part of our landscape?
I guess I can only speak to that more from the UK tradition of it. It's always had a really problematic relationship with the Arts Council over the years, partly through its association with the community arts movement, partly through its very explicitly kind of left-wing and Marxist, essentially, kind of approach to things. But at the same time, it's almost one of those ideas or kind of cluster of concepts whose time has come again. I mean, I hear an awful lot at the moment about the need for kind of intersectional approaches to cultural policy that cut across class and race and gender and so on. I mean, cultural democracy was an intersectional approach to inequalities in culture, because it's very clear within a lot of that work. I think, as Owen Kelly says, you cannot have cultural democracy without social democracy, economic democracy, and political democracy. They all go hand in hand. And we make a very big mistake, I think, in the cultural policy if we think that cultural policy is just something that exists in isolation that we can change and debate and talk about, as if it doesn't, it's not part of a much wider society. But fundamentally, a cultural democracy challenges power, it challenges authority, it challenges vested interest. I mean, you can see the Royal Opera House in London is my go-to straw man example for all of this, but everybody has their own. You can see that as a high temple to the greatest that human civilization has achieved, or you can see it as a kind of institutionalized form of socio-cultural power. Because if we start to talk about how, as bizarrely the Arts Council have done in their strategy, that apparently no form of culture has any more or less value than any other, then when you migrate that from an abstract conceptual discussion into, well, who's getting this money, then suddenly it's a whole other ball game, because then you're in power, contacts, vested interest, perpetuation. People who are on very nice salaries in very large cultural institutions rarely are the turkeys voting for Christmas in the cultural sector going, do you know what, I'm going to give up my power, I'm going to give up my position, I'm going to shut this institution down. And it's where we've ended up in this ridiculous situation, I think, where what we see over and over again is what quite rightly is called virtue signaling, around this understanding of the need for change, this understanding of these structural issues within the sector, but no change. So
right. I call that change paralysis.
I did very well at stopping myself from swearing then. I just want to record that for the record.
No, we're at this exquisitely awkward moment where everyone knows things need to change, but yet we lack a sort of framework or model for what that change looks like. And that's what excited me so much about this dual model is that cultural democracy as an idea is something to be very appealing to a lot of people. Of course, when you get into it, like implementing that, what does it actually mean to make that commitment? What does it look like programmatically in terms of how money flows? But the same in the US, Stephen, if a big philanthropic foundation announced a new grant program to support cultural democracy, all these big companies would raise their hands saying, oh, we do that. and it would move the sector in positive ways, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just starting some work at the moment. We're doing some work in Copenhagen, interestingly enough, about what does cultural democracy look like in 2021? Because that's one of the big issues actually around cultural democracy, is that the most significant blossoming of it, if you like, both in the US with Arlene and Don's work and in the UK, was pre-internet. It was pre-digital, and it was still tied to a lot of those kind of Marxist ideas about having both the means of production and the means of consumption. And I think there's a real need, because of course we all, theoretically at least, have the means of production now on our phones, if nowhere else. There's a need to re-engineer those concepts for the 21st century, is the first task. The second task is to really begin to investigate what that looks like in terms of a practical outplay from policy to organization on the ground, because it's very difficult. You can advocate for an idea, but you need to advocate for a reality that goes with that idea, I think.
I'm excited about cultural democracy, and even within an institution, the suggestion that those two value systems could coexist, they would be in tension with each other, perhaps. But I could see an opera company committing to cultural democracy as a part, if they wanted to, lifting up voices in their community. But it's a totally different paradigm of cultural production, right? And it requires sharing power.
It requires sharing power. It also requires disempowering the idea of excellence, which I think is key. Excellence as a concept. I mean, if you really want schizophrenia in cultural policy, just look at the tango between the ideas of excellence and access for the past 70 years in the UK. I mean, it's just absurd the amount of energy that's gone into trying to reconcile two things which are not reconcilable, in my opinion. But excellence, again, in the same way that democracy does, just very briefly, excellence has this really specific discursive function in the cultural sector, that it justifies astronomical and potentially infinite expenditure on certain forms of culture. That is a no-no in my book.
Right. So interesting questions we're getting from the gods and goddesses attending. So where does commercial culture fit into this? Isn't the commercialized cultural sector actually by definition democratic? And if our democratic needs are satisfied in the commercial arena, why can't the nonprofits devote themselves to excellence?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I'll come at it slightly tangentially, just to go back to the Kendrick Lamar riff, because one of the great narratives that kind of runs into the book is that kind of somewhat anti-American narrative, I guess, from the Frankfurt School onwards, about the kind of poison of popular culture seeping into the kind of collective civic sphere. And of course, we had this great paranoia about American mass culture in the 1950s and so on. And we've got this whole trajectory of kind of, white British upper class intellectuals telling us to fear the masses and their culture and so on. And all of us, lowest common denominators and so on. Fine. But what happens when you have Kendrick Lamar, right? Racially, socially, politically engaged, Obama's quoting him, he's winning like a Pulitzer, he's selling more records than every non-profit has sold tickets in a year, he's doing the job of the non-profits better than the non-profits without any subsidy on a scale they can only dream of. And when I use him as a teaching example, because I think he's such a good example of how the market actually does what the non-profit sector claims to do and does it better, which fundamentally forces us to challenge that narrative of these kind of threats of mass culture. But having said that, I think you're in cuckoo land if you think the market is a democratic space. I don't buy that. That's a different conversation, but like the market is an arena where the public choice can play out, but there are so many controls and constraints on that market.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I buy into that argument. I'm trying to keep my answers short.
Yeah, no, great. This is all great. Santiago has a question for Stephen, which I do too, which is, are there examples of nonprofits actually incorporating cultural democracy as opposed to democratization of culture? We know what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the Creative People and Places program was in England was really one of the key ways that this whole debate has taken off. And it's a really fascinating case study, because Creative People and Places essentially started out in that kind of marketing cold spots, like kind of mindset, going these poor sods in Stoke, they've got no culture, it's a cold spot, they're not properly engaged, we've mapped this, it's kind of the great unwashed, take it to them, let them have a bit of action kind of thing. And of course what it's morphed into is quite a fundamental challenge to the very premises that the Arts Council is based on. So there's an as with everything in the subsidized cultural sector, it's very difficult to generalize, because if I try and generalize about the cultural sector, somebody will go, oh no, here's an example from Minnesota about this organization that proves you're wrong. So we're always on this kind of spectrum of activity here. But what was incredibly pertinent was that when the Arts Council had the draft of this Let's Create strategy, they called a meeting in London in late 2018 and invited the chief executives of all the major national institutions to attend this meeting and have a quick look at the draft of the strategy, check it was okay. And the minutes of the meeting make quite interesting reading, because the strategy caused such alarm with the chief executives of national organisations that Simon Mellor, who's the deputy director of the Arts Council, is on record saying, but of course the Royal Opera House is as important as Creative People and Places. Now, imagine a deputy director of the Arts Council having to reassure Alex Beard, the chief executive of the Royal Opera House, that this tiny little cultural democracy project, it's all right, the Royal Opera House is as important. Like, that's, for cultural policy nerds like me, that's a major moment when suddenly these institutions are going, Jesus, what are they doing? Like, and where's our grant going to go? So I don't think it's hit the national portfolio per se. I mean, there are examples of everything everywhere, but that's, I think what needs to be done is it's questions of scale. Okay, what happens when a national organization engages with it? So
right. I think cultural democracy lives in municipal contexts, perhaps of and placemaking, and perhaps some other areas, but it's not. It has not taken root, at least from what I can see, in the sort of large institutions. With Western-based art forms. Santiago, I think part of what we suffer from is a lack of exemplars of what successful implementation of cultural democracy commitment looks like.
Also, though, I mean, we're talking about value here. We're talking about attribution of cultural value. We're talking about attribution of power to say what has value. So the market obviously confers one type of value, the Arts Council confers another type of value, but cultural democracy is everywhere. And the books on my shelf and the records over there, that's me being culturally democratic and deciding what I think has value. The challenge here is to elevate this kind of community-led and community-level activity into the structures of power. because it's that power and authority, the cultural authority to allocate value is what we're talking about here. And that's where this conversation needs to go.
Yeah, that's terrific. And a really interesting provocation about the explosion of digital programming. And do you see that as having a positive effect on cultural democracy?
That's a very complex question. I'm just looking at the clock and thinking that's like an hour-long answer to that question. I suppose what I'll say is I think we're in a really interesting, God, I'm going to just make the most banal comment of all time by saying we're at a really interesting moment in history. But in this kind of COVID and hopefully post-COVID moment, I think what I'm seeing is that all the problems and dilemmas we took into COVID, we're now still taking out on the other side, okay? Because all of those debates around whether digital was a democratizing force, and in what way was it democratizing? Or was it really just, if you live in the city, you can have it live, but if you live in the sticks, you can watch it on the screen and thank us for it at the same time, So I think the dilemmas of whether digital is a force for democratization are still with us to some extent. And it probably does an awful lot of those things that audience development did, was that it makes it look like things are being more democratic, but in 10 years' time, we'll look back and somebody will produce a report and we'll go, oh God, digital never really shifted anything, did it? It just kind of, so that's probably my pessimistic assertion anyway.
Yeah, well, my optimistic assertion is that cultural democracy is, as an idea, has a new opportunity now to take root in a way that it hasn't, because of not just COVID, but because of our reckoning as a sector with racial justice and the need for some framework, some guiding principle that would allow people to grasp what needs to be different. What can we do? So I'm terrifically excited, Stephen, at your analysis and all that will come out of it. I have the sinking feeling that at least I'm going to spend the next 3 years of my life unpacking your book for cultural practitioners. And there's just so much great dialogue to come out of this. So I'll send it back to Doug to bring us home and wrap up.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, wonderful. Well, let's give another round of applause here for Stephen for joining us and sharing about his book. Run out and buy it at your local bookstore 6 feet away from someone right now. No, thank you. That was great. Enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Alan Brown, for moderating what was a very interesting discussion. And before you log off, if you get a chance, do scroll through the chat section. There's a lot of really interesting content in there. And I appreciate everyone taking the time to write stuff in. And we hope to see you again at a future CCA workshop. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Great to see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.